Well, I think part of that was a very nice paper, congratulations. But I think part of what we're going to have to get away from is what I was stressing. It's not whether GM crops are good and the technology is good, because there's nothing general about it and there's nothing dangerous about it and there's nothing common to it. It's really whether a particular improved crop is good or not. Otherwise, it's, to me, sort of like asking whether heterozygous plants are more vigorous than non-heterozygous ones, or whether if you had a as I said, a double recessive cross in the ancestry, you'd be more likely to have a good crop or not. I think what we show by something like the Indian example of cotton, which shows it very, very clearly, is that that particular BT producing cotton does very well under those circumstances. It doesn't show that GM methods are good or bad. GM methods are still just a method. It doesn't show they're safe. It doesn't show they're not safe. Of course, like any plant breeding, they can produce better products or lesser products, and some of them will produce better, and if they do, farmers will buy them. Now, I realize that that's naive with respect to the actual existing environment, but I do think it's where we need to get, and the sooner the better.
So you mentioned that the main traits that GMO crops have selected for or have modified is insect resistance and herbicide resistance. Now, we also heard, for example, about Harvest Plus and all these nutrient improvements, and we saw pictures of crops that had better yields that looked like there were better yields because the crops themselves looked more robust. And I'm wondering whether, is it just that there's no penetration of those things we heard about from Harvest Plus, or are we talking about different things here? How do we reconcile that?
Well, what Howdy Buies presented, the Harvest Plus materials, that is non-transgenic. So those are conventional materials, okay. I've been talking about transgenics now. I mean, Howdy mentioned that using transgenics, the products could be further improved and higher levels of micronutrients could be in there, and that is and because transgenics have to go through that regulatory procedure and they have to be approved, and that can take forever because policymakers and regulators are not giving that approval for the concerns of the public and all those debates. And what we saw, what Peter Bayer presented in terms of higher yield potentials, that is a proof of concept, and it has been tested in greenhouses and possibly in the field, but it's not a product that hasn't been picked up by farmers because farmers wouldn't love that. It hasn't been, they have not had the chance to pick it up because it's not, hasn't been brought through the regulatory procedure and not approved yet.
Thank you.
And that's the concern. I mean, we're having, as Peter Raven says, we're having a potent tool in breeding, an additional tool that's not substituting for other tools, but if you integrate that, you can do tremendously interesting things. You can do things that you couldn't do without those tools. You can do things more efficiently, but there's a totally different regulatory approach to GMOs than to any other breeding technology.
Yeah. Sitting at your back, so it's a bit difficult. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I have, first, thanks for an excellent talk. I learned a lot, really, and in particular, I have not known about these meta studies, which are very powerful. I have, the first question is, I mean, you showed that yield is increasing, of course, for certain types, of course, while costs stay more or less flat. But the profits of the farmers go up tremendously. Yeah? So can you explain this, why that works? And the second question is somehow related to it. You said in certain countries, or many countries actually, it's patent free. You have national law. So what's the motivation for companies to develop then these things if there are no intellectual property rights secured?
Well, the technologies that we're talking about, the BT and the herbicide tolerance, they have not primarily been developed for poor farmers in developing countries. They have been developed for the US market primarily, perhaps hoping also to get penetration into Europe. That didn't work out. But those are patented technologies, and when you look at the seed costs, they are relatively high in the US. And when you look at the total benefit that the technology generates, then in the US, about 2/3 of the benefits are captured by the patent holder, in most cases Monsanto, and 1/3 by farmers. And in developing countries, this is quite different. It may be turned around, 1/3 for the company, 2/3 for the farmer. In some cases, it's even much more. We have done a study on Roundup Ready soybeans, that's the herbicide tolerance in Argentina, a couple of years back, where we saw that 90% of the benefits are captured by farmers, because farmers are even they're replanting their GM seeds. There's a widespread belief that technically you couldn't replant GM seeds, and that is not true. You can certainly replant the seeds. You can do it technically, and you can do it legally when there is no patent on it. And that holds true in many of the countries. So also in China, the BT cotton seeds, they're replanted by farmers, and that makes it more difficult for companies to make money, and that's also the reason why for those technologies that are specifically developed for small farmers in developing countries, we will need much more public sector involvement. It's not going to be done only by the multinationals, and it's very unfortunate that the situation we see is that they're only controlling basically the technology, but the reason is if the public is so much against the technology, then public research institutes have a hard time in explaining that they're using taxpayers' money on something that the public really is so much against. So we have that problem, which I see as a problem. I would really think that many of the interesting technologies for food security will have to be developed by the public sector.